She stood at the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself as though the evening air had settled too heavily on her shoulders. "It feels colder tonight," she said, her voice soft, but edged with something unspoken. I should have stepped back, let the words fade into the silence of the quiet street. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself watching the way the porch light curved along her cheek, the faint trace of vulnerability hiding beneath her graceful posture. She was older than me, beautiful in a way that wasn't fragile, but certain. 40, maybe 45, though I never dared to ask. A widow. The kind of woman whose presence seemed to steady a room even when her eyes gave away the storms she carried. I shifted my weight, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you want to come inside? Just for a while." Her gaze lingered on me longer than it should have. A pause stretched thin and taut before she nodded. "Only for a moment," she said, though we both knew moments had a way of lasting longer when silence filled them. Inside, the air was warmer, but she didn't unwrap her arms right away. She walked slowly, her heels soft against the wooden floor. I noticed the small things, the way her hair brushed against the collar of her coat, the faint scent of jasmine that followed her like a memory. She stopped near the window, looking out as though the world outside might give her an excuse to leave. I wanted to speak, to break the quiet, but instead my hands betrayed me. I reached for the mug on the table, offering it with a nervous smile. "It's just tea. Nothing special." Her fingers brushed mine as she took it. Just a touch, barely there, but it was enough to send a pulse through me I didn't know how to hide. She noticed. I could tell by the faint curve of her lips, the way she avoided meeting my eyes for a breath too long. She set the cup down without drinking, turning slightly toward me. "You always keep it too warm in here," she murmured. I swallowed hard, searching for something clever, but the words stuck. Instead, I watched as her coat slipped slightly from her shoulder, revealing the softness of skin that caught the dim light. She pulled it back quickly, almost carelessly, but the small reveal burned into me. Her voice came quieter now. "It's strange. Sometimes the house feels colder since he's been gone." The sentence hung between us, heavy with meaning she didn't explain. I didn't push. I couldn't. But the way she said it, half confession, half accident, left me standing closer than before. I leaned against the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. "You don't have to sit in the cold," I said finally, my voice lower than I expected. Her eyes lifted to mine then, unflinching. There it was, the unspoken challenge, the test of whether I would step back or stay where I was. Her gaze didn't let me go. The silence thickened, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. Then, as if guided by something neither of us dared to name, her hand brushed mine again. Not by accident this time. Her touch lingered. My chest tightened. My breath caught. I should have said something, should have moved, but every part of me stayed still, suspended in that single electric moment. Her lips parted, as though she was about to speak, and then, from outside, the sound of a door opening cut through the quiet. We both froze, caught in the charged space between what had just almost happened, and what we couldn't yet admit. The sound outside faded, and when the quiet returned, she let out a breath I hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back to me, as if weighing something private. "I don't usually stay this long," she said softly, adjusting the sleeve of her coat. I wanted to ask why she stayed, but the words felt too fragile. Instead, I studied the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her cup, her rings catching the low light. There was history in her silence, and though she didn't say it directly, I could feel the weight of it. Her husband. The years spent together. The quiet, empty house next door where laughter had turned into long shadows. Everyone in the neighborhood still treated her gently, almost cautiously, like she was glass that might crack if handled too firmly. But tonight, here, she wasn't fragile. She was alive. She turned suddenly, catching me staring longer than I meant to. A small smile played at her lips. "You look at me too much," she teased, though her voice carried no real protest. Heat rose in my face. Sorry, I faltered, fumbling for a safer excuse. You're different when you smile. I don't see it often. Her expression shifted, softening for a heartbeat before she looked away. That's because I don't often feel like smiling anymore. The confession hung in the air, heavier than anything else we had shared. And still, I couldn't look away from her. The difference between us, our ages, the inevitable judgment, the whisper of taboo that hovered at the edges of thought, it should have been enough to keep me distant. But it wasn't. When she moved closer, standing beside me to glance at the books scattered across the table, I felt the warmth of her body near mine. She leaned just slightly, her arm brushing against my shoulder, her breath close enough that I caught the faint sweetness of tea and jasmine. I forced my eyes downward, afraid she'd see too much written across my face. But my restraint betrayed me, my hand shifted unconsciously, as though drawn toward hers. She noticed. I know she did, because she hesitated before pulling back, her voice quieter now. We shouldn't let people misunderstand. There was truth in her words, but the way her hand lingered a moment longer on the back of my chair said something entirely different. I turned my head then, close enough that I could see the faint line of worry between her brows. Do you care what they think? I asked carefully. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at me, really looked at me, as though searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Then, almost too gently, she reached out and smoothed a wrinkle from my shirt, her fingertips trailing longer than necessary. The touch froze me in place. It wasn't bold. It wasn't reckless. But it was real. When she pulled her hand back, her lips curved just slightly, a secret only the two of us shared. And in that quiet, charged pause, with nothing spoken but everything felt, I realized something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The night stretched longer than either of us planned. She lingered by the window, tracing the glass with absent fingers, while I stood a step too close, unable to break the invisible pull between us. I opened my mouth to speak, but before a word left, her phone buzzed against the table. The sound made her flinch. She glanced at the screen, lips tightening, before quickly pressing it silent. I caught a glimpse of the name flashing there, one of the neighbors, the type who checked in often, the type who would never understand what it meant for her to be here. She turned the phone face down, her shoulders tense. They worry too much, she said, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. I didn't answer. Instead, I studied the way her hand trembled slightly as she brushed hair behind her ear. For the first time, she seemed less untouchable, more human, more uncertain. And I wanted to be the one she leaned on. I stepped closer, until the warmth of her body reached me. She noticed. Her breath caught, just enough for me to hear. The silence pressed hard between us. Her eyes lifted, locking with mine. Every beat of my heart seemed louder than the room itself. This isn't, she whispered, voice fading before she finished. But she didn't step back. My hand rose almost without thought, hovering near her arm, then settling lightly against her sleeve. She froze, but didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes closed for the briefest second, as if letting herself feel the weight of a touch she hadn't expected. I leaned in, not enough to cross the line, but enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath brushing against my lips. She opened her eyes then, and the world shrank down to just that moment, two people on the edge of something neither could name out loud. Then, footsteps outside. Her head snapped toward the door, panic flickering across her face. She stepped back quickly, putting space between us just as the sound passed by, fading into the night. The air between us changed, charged, dangerous, yet impossible to ignore. She laughed softly, but the sound was thin, fragile. See? That's exactly what I meant. I swallowed hard, my voice low. But you didn't move until you had to. Her eyes flickered, searching mine for an escape, but none came. The silence that followed said more than either of us dared. She shifted closer again, not quite closing the gap, but enough that her shoulder brushed mine, soft and deliberate. My pulse hammered, my restraint thin as glass. The tension was unbearable. Every glance, every breath, every unfinished word pulled us tighter. And though neither of us gave in fully, when her hand brushed mine once more, lingering longer this time, we both knew, resisting only drew us closer. Closer than we had ever been. Closer than we should have been. The quiet between us had grown dangerous, too full, too charged. Every time I looked at her, I found something I wasn't supposed to want, the curve of her lips when she tried not to smile, the way her eyes softened in the dim light, the way her body leaned ever so slightly toward mine before she caught herself. She stood near the kitchen counter now, her hand resting lightly on the wood. I couldn't stop watching the way her fingers traced slow circles on the surface, as if they longed for something to do. I stepped closer, every movement deliberate, though my chest pounded. Her eyes flicked up to mine, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "You shouldn't be this close," she murmured, though her voice betrayed her. I swallowed, my breath unsteady. "Then tell me to move." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she shifted back half a step, only for her shoulder to brush mine again when I mirrored the movement. The air thickened. My hand rose almost without permission, brushing a strand of hair from her face. My fingertips lingered against her temple longer than they should have, memorizing the warmth of her skin. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, leaning just slightly into the touch, as though starved for it. When she opened them again, they shone with something fragile and fierce all at once. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, her voice unsteady now. I leaned closer, my words brushing the space near her ear. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Her breath hitched. She turned her face toward me, so close now that the tip of her nose nearly touched mine. Every hesitation, every boundary we'd danced around, collapsed in the space of that charged silence. But then, a flicker of fear crossed her features. She stepped back, shaking her head. "People will talk. They'll look at me differently. At you differently. I've already been the subject of whispers once in my life, I can't." Her voice trailed off, thick with something between anger and grief. I reached for her wrist, gently but firmly, grounding her. "I don't care what they say. Do you?" Her eyes locked on mine, searching, trembling. Then, with a sudden rush, she pulled her hand free and pressed it against my chest, right where my heart raced. "That's exactly why I should care," she whispered, her palm lingering, her touch betraying her words. The room spun smaller, tighter. I covered her hand with mine, holding it against me. The warmth seeped into my skin, branding me with a truth neither of us could erase. For a long moment, we stood frozen, her chest rising and falling quickly, my breath tangled with hers. Her gaze dropped to my lips. And mine to hers. The distance between us vanished until only an inch remained. Her fingers curled slightly against my chest, pulling me closer, even as her body trembled with hesitation. I tilted my head, lowering my voice to a whisper only she could hear. "Tell me to stop." She didn't. Instead, her eyes closed slowly, and her lips parted, when suddenly, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. We jolted apart, the air between us snapping like glass. The knock came again, louder this time. Her hand hovered in the air, as if unsure whether to reach back for me, or hide the truth of what had almost happened. Her eyes met mine, wide, conflicted, and filled with something that couldn't be undone. And in that fragile heartbeat, I realized, whether the door opened or not, we had already crossed the point of no return. The knocking faded into silence. Whoever it was had left. But the damage lingered, sharp and unshakable. She pressed her back to the counter, her hand against her chest as though to steady her breathing. I stood a few feet away, fists curled at my sides, my body still humming with everything that almost happened. Her eyes lifted to mine, a storm of emotions crossing her face. Guilt. Want. Fear. Something else I couldn't name. Finally, she spoke, low, almost broken. "You think this is just about the neighbors talking?" "It isn't." I frowned, stepping closer. "Then what is it?" Her lips trembled before forming the words. "They already think I moved on too fast. That I didn't grieve long enough. But the truth is, she stopped, shaking her head, as if the words themselves were too dangerous. I closed the space between us, close enough to feel her unease and the tremor of her hand as it brushed past mine. "Tell me," I urged. Her eyes shut tight. "I was lonely long before he died." The confession knocked the breath out of me. She looked at me again, pain and relief tangled in her gaze. My marriage wasn't what everyone thought. They all believed we were happy, solid. But I hadn't felt wanted in years. And now, if anyone found out, if they saw me here, with you, her voice cracked. They'd think I was shameless. They'd think you were foolish. And maybe they'd be right. The room pulsed with her honesty. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she brushed past me, her shoulder grazing mine, and the contact nearly unraveled my restraint. I turned quickly, catching her wrist before she slipped away. Her body stilled, her breath shallow. "You're not shameless," I said firmly. "And I'm not a fool." Her hand trembled in my grip. She tried to pull back, but her eyes betrayed her. They searched mine, desperately, as though looking for proof she wasn't allowed to ask for. When I didn't let go, her body softened, surrendering to the closeness we both fought. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered, her forehead almost leaning into mine. "But you don't know what it's like to live under eyes that judge every step you take." I lowered my voice, the words brushing the space near her lips. "Then stop living for them." Her breath hitched again. Her free hand rose, unsteady, pressing against my chest. She wasn't pushing me away. She was holding me there, as if torn between fear and need. For a moment, neither of us breathed. Then, the sound of her phone cut through, the same neighbor calling again, the screen lighting up the table. She pulled her hand back as though burned, stepping away, panic flashing in her eyes. But before she could retreat further, I closed the distance, my words firm. "Answer it. Or don't. But stop pretending you don't want to be here." Her lips parted, trembling with denial that wouldn't come. The phone rang once more, then went silent. Her eyes flickered with something raw, desire tangled with fear. She didn't speak. Instead, she moved closer again, close enough that the sleeve of her sweater brushed my arm, close enough that her warmth seeped into me. And this time, when the silence stretched, she didn't step back. She chose to stay. And I knew, in that unspoken decision, we had crossed into something we could never hide again. The silence after the phone stopped ringing was louder than any sound. She stood frozen near the counter, her chest rising quickly, her eyes darting between me and the phone as though torn in two. I took a step forward. Then another. Until there was no space left but the kind that could be broken with a single breath. Her back brushed the counter, trapping her between me and the cold surface. I could feel her warmth, see the tremor in her lips as she tried to form words. "This isn't right," she whispered, though her voice had no strength. I leaned closer, my hand resting on the counter beside hers. "Then tell me to leave." Her eyes flicked to my mouth, lingered, then darted back up. "You don't understand what this means." I swallowed hard, every nerve alive. "Then explain it to me." "Because all I know is that I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath caught, shallow and unsteady. She pressed a hand to my chest, not to push me away but to feel the rhythm beneath her palm. Her touch lingered there, her fingers curling as though clinging to the very thing she was afraid of. "You're too young," she said, but it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. I covered her hand with mine, holding it against me. "And you're too scared." But neither of those things changes this. The distance between us collapsed. I tilted my head, close enough now that her breath warmed my cheek, close enough that her perfume, faint jasmine and something warmer, wrapped around me like a tether. Her lips parted, trembling. My own hovered just above them, every muscle fighting between restraint and surrender. She whispered then, so soft I barely heard it. "If we do this, there's no going back." I let the silence answer for me. Her eyes closed, her body leaning into mine at last. Her hand slid from my chest to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. The weight of years, of hesitation, of fear, collapsed into that single, irreversible moment. Our foreheads touched. My breath tangled with hers. The world fell away until there was only the pulse of her heartbeat, the heat of her body, and the truth neither of us could deny anymore. She opened her eyes again, only inches away, her gaze filled with a rawness I had never seen before. And finally, she whispered the only words that mattered. "Don't stop." The choice was made, not in logic, not in safety, but in the undeniable pull between us. Messy. Flawed. Human. Real. For the first time, she wasn't pulling away. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to hold her there. We understood each other fully now. There would be no pretending after this. The first kiss ended almost as soon as it began, soft, trembling, unfinished. Not because we didn't want more, but because the weight of what just happened pressed heavy between us. Her hand slipped from my neck and fell to her side. For a moment, I thought she'd pull away again, put distance back where closeness had bloomed. But she didn't. She just stood there, chest rising and falling, eyes shimmering with something too deep for words. I touched her hand gently. This time, she didn't flinch. She let my fingers intertwine with hers, her palm warm, trembling slightly against mine. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long convincing myself I'm past all of this. That my time for something real, something new, had already ended." I squeezed her hand, lifting it slowly to my lips. I kissed the back of it, lingering there. "And yet here we are," I said softly. "Maybe it's not about time. Maybe it's just about us." Her eyes closed at the touch, her breath hitching. When she opened them again, she looked at me differently, not as the boy next door, not as someone who would fade from her life, but as the man standing in front of her now. The silence that followed was the kind that didn't need to be filled. I stepped closer, wrapping an arm carefully around her waist, pulling her against me. She leaned into the embrace almost immediately, her head resting against my chest, her body molding to mine like it had been waiting for this moment. I could feel everything in that hug, her hesitation melting, her loneliness easing, her heart beginning to trust. My chin brushed the top of her hair as I closed my eyes and held her tighter. "You're warm," she whispered, the faintest smile curling at her lips. I chuckled softly, pressing a kiss against her forehead. "Didn't you say you were cold?" Her laugh, quiet, nervous, but real, was the most beautiful sound I'd heard all night. When she looked up again, her face was only inches from mine. No urgency now. No fear. Just closeness. She reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead, her fingers trailing a little too long against my skin. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "You see me in ways I thought no one would again." "And you," I answered, my hand brushing along her arm, "make it impossible to pretend I don't feel this." We stood there in the kitchen, two people who shouldn't have found this connection, but did. The world outside was still the same. Neighbors would talk, time would pass, and doubts might return. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered. She pulled my hand toward the couch, and we sat down together, her shoulder against mine, my arm still around her. There was no rush, no need for words. Just the quiet certainty that we had chosen each other despite everything that could have stood in the way. I looked at her profile, the curve of her smile, the softness in her eyes. She turned toward me, and I kissed her again, slower this time, sure, grounded. And when we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine and whispered, "Stay." I nodded. There was nowhere else I wanted to be. For the first time, the air between us wasn't filled with tension or doubt. It was filled with something deeper, something steady. Something that felt like the beginning of a story neither of us thought we'd ever write. We sat there in the quiet, hands entwined, her head on my shoulder, hearts steady and unguarded at last. Together.